Relay 7 didn't have a name worth remembering. It was a speck of welded light and recycled air hanging at the dead end of the Orion arm, 14 light-years past the last official human presence marker, doing the one job nobody else wanted listening. Mara Chun had been its senior engineer for 6 years, and in 6 years the station had heard nothing worth hearing. Static, solar wind, the occasional garbled distress ping from a freighter that had already stopped pinging by the time it arrived. That morning, Mara was elbow-deep in the secondary air scrubber, tasting copper and ozone, when the proximity alarm went off. Not the soft chime of a scheduled supply drone, but the long, flat wail of something big dropping out of fold space without announcing itself. She straightened too fast, cracked her skull on the access panel, and swore in 3 languages before she looked at the main display. The ship hanging in the void beside Relay 7 was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that was exactly why it terrified her. It was a kilometer of pale, seamless geometry, curves that caught the local star's light and redirected it into a slow, hypnotic shimmer. No running lights, no registry sigil. It simply sat there, patient as a held breath, the way a monument sits over a grave. "Talk to me, station," Mara said, wiping her hands on her coveralls. Around her, the relay systems began chattering in soft alarms, trajectory analysis, mass estimate, threat assessment, the last one blinking red with the kind of stubborn certainty a machine develops when it is asked to describe something it has no data for. "Reading 1 vessel," came Chief Osei's voice from the comm deck, tight and clipped. "0 transponder match. 0 hails. Mass. The computer says the computer is lying." A chime filled the deck. Not an alarm this time. A doorbell, polite and unhurried, as if the visitor had all the time in every universe. The main screen flickered, and the static resolved itself into a face. Mara had seen holos of the Accord's Herald cast before. Every human had, in the compulsory briefings that read like fairy tales told by frightened people. But seeing one in person, even through a screen, was different. It looked like a person the way a cathedral looks like a house. Tall, pale, still, its eyes were the color of deep water, and when it spoke, its voice arrived in the room before the words did, layered and harmonic, smooth as oiled glass. "Relay 7 of the Terran continuity," it said. "You will receive a document. You will read it. You will transmit your species' formal response within 3 standard cycles. This is the Great Accord, and it is not a negotiation." The screen went dark. The document came through a moment later. 400,000 pages of something that smelled, in Mara's imagination, like a contract written by a species that had never once heard the word no. She read the first page, then the second. Then she sat down on the deck plating, among the spilled tools and the smeared grease, and read it all the way through a night into a morning, because the document was simple, in the way a wall is simple. It was a surrender. Kovac had declared the synth roast recycled boot scrapings, and Ilsa had responded with a wrench gently, in the manner of a woman who has made her final peace with murder. But 3 days is exactly long enough to read 400,000 pages of the Great Accord, and that was the problem. They gathered in a mess, all 7 of them, around the bolted-down table with the viewport looking out on the pale ship that had not moved, would not move, and had not blinked once in 40 hours. Mara had printed the Accord's executive summary, 60 pages of dense, bureaucratic monstrosity, and pinned it to the wall like a dead thing she wanted to identify. "Here's the shape of it," she said. "The authority, the Accord's administrators, have folded 4,000 species into one government. They don't call it conquest. They call it convergence. Unification. Every species that signs gets protection, technology, immortality for its elites, the works. And in exchange, they give up exactly one thing." "Everything," said Osei quietly. He was the oldest of them, a former Navy signals officer with gray at his temples and the patient eyes of a man who had outlived every war he had been issued. "Everything," Mara agreed. "Sovereignty, weapons, the right to say no to anything, ever again, in any context forever. Their census gets folded into the Accord's registry. Their children get logged against the compliance index, so the Accord can identify at birth which members of a species might later develop what they call convergence resistance." Kovac, the engineer, stopped mid-chew. They lawed babies. Like inventory. Like inventory, said Mara. And the species that don't sign. Mara pointed at a paragraph near the bottom. Its language even more florid. Its threat even more naked. The Accord is the only sustainable state of galactic civilization, allegedly. Non-signatories are restored to compatibility, which means the authority arrives in force, finds whoever currently speaks for the species, and has them sign. It's a process, not a war. They've never once had to actually fire on a populated world, because no species ever makes it to that step. The herald arrives. The document is read, and the species signs, because the herald always asks the one question nobody has ever answered with anything but a pen. What question? Ilsa asked. Mara looked up from the pages. Her face, under the station's hard white lights, looked like a woman who had just discovered that the floor was a door. Who speaks for your people? She said. That's the whole trick. Every species has a voice, a council, a queen, a consensus neural net, a parliament of elders, one throat, one signature, one moment of terrified obedience, and it's done. The Accord doesn't conquer planets. It finds the throat and squeezes. The mess went quiet. Outside the viewport, the shimmering ship rotated a single degree, like a shark adjusting its course in a dream. So, said Kovac slowly, we have 3 days to produce a throat for 8 billion humans. We have 3 days, said Mara, to figure out what happens when the throat says no. None of them slept well that night, and it showed the next morning. Red eyes, stale coffee, and one blistering argument that started before breakfast and didn't end until midday. Osei wanted to run. The station's emergency fold drive could get them to the inner rim systems in 11 jumps, and Earth needed to know. Kovac wanted to fight. He had spent a decade in his late 20s as a militia engineer and spoke of improvised detonators the way other men spoke of old girlfriends. Ilsa, the station medic, X-Field, hospital, wanted to stall, to ask for extensions, to keep the Herald waiting until Earth Command decided something, anything, because humans had learned, she said, that the universe rarely gives you a deadline without also giving you a loophole. Only Shay, the youngest, the comm specialist who had joined the relay 3 months ago with her whole life, still written in pencil, said what all of them were thinking. They're going to come aboard, she said. When the time runs out, they're going to come aboard and make someone sign. Nobody contradicted her. Nobody promised her it wouldn't happen. That was, Mara thought with a strange low pride, the most human response the room had produced all day. Nobody lied about the shape of the threat. They just started arguing about what to do with it. The argument didn't resolve. It did something better. It ground itself down into a decision, the way glaciers grind themselves down into rivers, slowly, and with tremendous unglamorous pressure from 1,000 small rocks. By that evening they had agreed on the only thing any of them could agree on. They were going to answer the document. They would answer it as themselves, individually, imperfectly, in 7 different voices, because that was the one thing the Accord's whole machinery had never been built to handle. Shay set the recorder running in the comm studio, and they took turns, one after another, standing in front of the microphone, looking into the lens, and reading the same opening line in their own way. To the administrators of the Great Accord, we acknowledge receipt of your document. Then each of them said something different. Osei said, I'm the Chief Signals Officer. I don't have the authority to sign anything. And I checked. Neither does anyone else on this station. Kovac said, you want a signature? Here's my signature. It's not worth anything. It never was. That's the thing about us. We gave up on one voice deciding everything a long time ago, because it kept killing us. Ilsa said, I've held dying people's hands for 15 years. They all said the same thing at the end. They asked me not to let them die alone. We don't do surrender in this species. Administrator, we do accompaniment. If you want to take us, you're going to have to take us together. Shay said, I'm 22. I haven't decided who I am yet. You want me to decide the fate of humanity before I've even decided what I want for breakfast. That's not how this works. And Mara last said, we're acknowledging receipt. That's all. We haven't finished reading. We'll transmit our formal response when we're good and ready, and not a cycle sooner. Shay hit transmit, The message shot out of Relay 7's dish, a small, ragged, 7-voiced no, aimed at the most powerful administrative machine in the known galaxy. For 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then the pale ship's running lights came on. All at once, the weigh-in eye opens, and the herald's voice filled the station from every speaker at once, still layered, still harmonic, but carrying in its undertones something the crew had not heard before, something between puzzlement and a slowly revolving appetite. Transmission received and logged. The Accord notes a procedural irregularity in your response format. The Accord requires a single authorized signatory. Please designate one. Mara looked at her crew and smiled, and the smile was a little bit feral, the way human smiles get when the universe asks them to be small. We're designating, she said. All of us. Every time. That's our format. Get used to it. The Accord's second move came 11 hours later, and it came without warning, which was the first sign that they had stopped treating the station like a signatory and started treating it like a problem. There was no announcement, no hiss of teleportation, no boarding craft, just a sound. It rose out of the station's own internal speakers, which should have been impossible because the comm array was physically isolated from the life support network, and it filled every compartment like water filling a drowned ship. It was a tone, one long, sustained, impossibly pure note, the kind of note a tuning fork might make if the tuning fork were the size of a moon and had been calibrated by people who understood, intimately, what it meant to be prey. On the deck in the mess, Osei went down first, without a sound. One moment he was standing at the galley counter, refilling his coffee, and the next he was on the floor, his mug rolling away in a lazy arc, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep as sleep. Ilsa followed 40 seconds later, folding at the knees as if someone had pulled her strings. Shay made it halfway down the corridor before she slid along the wall and lay curled in the shadow of a fire extinguisher cabinet like a child who had simply run out of day. Mara felt it too. The tone wrapped around her brainstem and squeezed, softly, coaxingly. And what it was saying, she understood it with a clarity that horrified her, was rest. Stop. It does not have to hurt anymore. The universe is enormous and you are so small. And it is such a relief, isn't it? To finally be allowed to stop carrying the weight of being a thing that decides. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the engineering console, her knuckles white, her vision swimming at the edges. The tone deepened, grew more tender, more insistent, and Mara Chun, engineer, cynic, a woman who had once fixed a reactor with a wrench, a prayer, and a roll of duct tape, felt her body begin to surrender to the enormous gentleness of it. And then her physiology, 600,000 years of it, forged on a planet where the sunrise could kill you and the shadows could eat you, and the only people who survived were the ones who never, ever stopped moving, did something that no other species in the Accord's entire catalog had ever done in response to the tone. It read the sound for what it was, a predator's lullaby, a throat being bared, and it got angry. The wave of adrenaline hit Mara like a fist. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her vision sharpened into a blade's edge, her limbs filled with a terrible, bright, useless strength, and she heard herself roar, actually roar, a sound torn out of her diaphragm that she had never made before and would never make again. She ripped the emergency override panel off the wall with her bare hands and slammed her fist into the master brake. The tone cut off in mid-breath. The station rang with silence. On the floor, Osei snored. Ilsa's chest rose and fell. Shay murmured something in her sleep and rolled over, and Mara stood in the wreckage of the override panel, shaking, bleeding from her knuckles, and understood the thing that the Accord could not understand, because it had never met a species like hers. She was not relieved. She was furious, and fury, unlike submission, could not be toggled off with a tone. It was the whole shape of who her people were. Around the station, the other 4 crew members, Kovac, and the 2 techs, Milo and Run, surfaced groggily, clutching their heads, looking at the unconscious bodies on the deck. Kovac looked at Mara's bloody hand. He looked at the smoking ruin of the panel. He looked, very deliberately, at the pale ship in the viewport. Did we? He said slowly. Just when a fight that was a song? Mara flexed her bleeding fingers. We just found out, she said. that they've never once had to sing that song to a species that wanted to fight back. Not once, in 4,000 species worth of history. The station's comm array, still broadcasting on the open channel, picked up a new transmission from the pale ship. It was not the Herald's voice. It was a different voice, deeper, rougher, with the unmistakable texture of a creature that had been assembled for violence and then outfitted for administration. It spoke only one sentence, delivered with the flat certainty of a man reading a casualty report. Organic compliance vector failed. Initiating physical compliance protocol. Mara smiled her feral smile again, blood drying on her knuckles. Good, she said. We've been waiting for the part where they stop singing. The boarding party arrived 6 hours later, and the Accord did it the only way it knew how, with overwhelming, impersonal, immaculate force. A shuttle the size of a cathedral nave detached from the pale ship and docked at the station's main airlock without requesting permission, and the airlock cycled to admit a platoon of figures in seamless white armor that looked less like equipment and more like a second skin grown by a species that had long ago abandoned the messy business of individual faces. Behind them came the Herald. Up close, the Herald moved like a person who had never once in their existence been bumped into, effortless, unhurried, each motion a settled fact. It stopped at the threshold of the mess hall, where the 7 crew members stood in a rough human line, and its deep water eyes swept across them with what might have been, in a creature of flesh and blood, called curiosity. You are 8, it said. The Accord's registry of this station lists a complement of 7 Terran personnel. 2 of us were born on the S. Same day, said Shay deadpan. Our moms made a calendar mistake. Long story. The Herald's eyes moved, registering the joke, filing it, and setting it aside without comment. This is the physical compliance protocol. Order will be restored by the following method. The Accord requires a single signatory. It does not matter who. The process requires only that one of you, in good faith and sound mind, affix your designation to the document of accord. Upon completion, your species integration will proceed smoothly, and all 8 of you will be granted amnesty and reclassified as cooperating assets. All 8, said Osei. Generous. What happens to the other 6,999,000,000 of us? You are not cleared for that information. Please designate a signatory. There was a long silence. In the silence, the 7 humans did what humans do, which is to say, they communicated. No words crossed the room, but every one of them had spent years reading the others, and the message passed through the air like a current through wire, and the current said, not you, not you, not me, not me, none of us, never. I'll do it, said Kovac at last, and every head in the room snapped toward him. He walked forward, past the white-armored figures, past the Herald, and stopped at the document reader the Accord had set on the table, a sleek black slab pulsing with the glyphs of the Great Accord. He looked at it. He looked at the Herald. He picked up the reader and brought it down on the corner of the bolted-down table with every ounce of his militia-trained forearm, splitting the slab in 2 with a crack that echoed through the mess like a gunshot. There, he said pleasantly, dusting off his hands. That's my designation. I've affixed it to the document. We're integrated now. What's for dinner? The Herald's stillness deepened. Around them, the white-armored figures shifted their weight a millimeter, no more, and that millimeter was the loudest sound in the room. I see, said the Herald, and the harmonic layering of its voice flattened by a degree. The Accord has a provision for recalcitrant assets. The provision is, they are reclassified as impediments, and impediments are still not signatories, came a new voice. Mara stepped forward, past Kovac, past the broken reader, until she stood an arm's length from the Herald, looking up into those deep water eyes. That's the part you keep missing, Administrator. Look at us. 7 different temperaments. 7 different opinions on breakfast, on music, on whether the universe is a joke or a tragedy or both. We barely agree on anything. Do you know what we do agree on? She waited. The Herald did not answer. Perhaps it genuinely could not answer, because the question had no slot in its model of the universe. We agree on the word no, said Mara. That's the whole species. That's all we are, underneath everything. 8 billion of us. each one individually capable of looking at the most powerful thing in the known galaxy and saying no. Not as a strategy, not as a negotiation, but as a reflex, the way you breathe. You want a signatory. You want one throat to squeeze? We don't have one. We never did. Every species in your catalog has a hierarchy, a voice, a single point of failure. That's why you've never lost. But we built ourselves out of a planet that killed the ones who stood still. Administrator. Nobody speaks for us. That's not a bug in our design. That's the entire point of us. The Herald stared at her for a long, long moment. Behind it, the white armored figures had gone absolutely motionless, and Mara understood, with a distant, almost compassionate clarity, that she was looking at creatures who had never once in their existence been told no. Not by an equal, not by a peer, not by anything that mattered. The Herald said, very quietly, "Then you will be made to matter." "Good," said Mara, and her smile was not feral now. It was tired, and human, and utterly immovable. "We've been meaning to matter for a while." The Accord did not fire on Relay 7. That was the first surprise, and Mara filed it away like a specimen under glass. The Accord could not fire on a station that had not, in its bureaucratic accounting, attained the status of a military target. The station was, technically, a civilian facility. The Accord's conversion protocols required a formal declaration of hostility before kinetic action, and hostility had a specific legal definition in the Accord's 40 million clause charter, and a species that said no without violence had, strictly speaking, not yet qualified. So instead of destroying them, the Accord besieged them. The shuttle remained docked. The white armored platoon remained stationed at the airlock, impassive as furniture. The Herald returned to its ship, and the station systems began, one by one, with maddening bureaucratic exactness, to fail. First, the external comms went dark, not jammed, simply refused, as the Accord's web of influence asserted that Relay 7's communication license had been suspended pending integration. Then the supply schedule stopped. The drones that were due to arrive with food, water filters, and replacement scrubber media simply did not appear, and the Accord's reply to the station's polite query was a single line. "Resources will be made available upon integration." "No fire," said Osei, reading the status board, his voice flat. "No guns. They're just starving us. With paperwork." "Worse than starving us," said Mara. She stood at the engineering console, running the life support numbers for the 5th time. "They're demonstrating something. Look, the Accord has never had to besiege anyone. Every species in their catalog signed within hours. We're the first people in 4,000 species to make them sit down and wait, and they're showing us exactly what waiting looks like from their side. They can wait forever. We can't." "Classic siege logic," said Kovac, from where he was salvaging the broken document reader for parts. "They don't need to knock down the walls. They just need us to run out of what's behind them." "And what do we run out of first?" asked Ilsa, the medic, who had produced a battered notebook and was already, with the maddening calm of a woman who had triaged worse, making a list. "Water's fine. Recycling's fine," said Mara. "Food, 6 weeks, if we stretch it. Air, fine. Scrubbers are good. But the scrubber media needs replacing in 9 days, and the Accord just canceled the order. Power. The reactor's good for years, but the coolant loop." She stopped, checked a readout, and closed her eyes. "The coolant loop is the same loop the Accord's accidental surge fried last night. I can bypass it, but the bypass eats power. We have about 3 weeks of real time, maybe 4, before the station becomes a very expensive coffin." Silence. 7 people, 1 table, 1 viewport, and outside the viewport a kilometer of idle, patient, bureaucratic murder. "Okay," said Shay, and her voice was very small. "Okay, so we can't outlast them. We can't outfight them. There's a platoon of armored things at our door, and a ship the size of a mountain outside it. We can't outsign them, because signing is what they want. So what can we do?" Mara looked at her, and at the others, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She smiled, not the feral smile, not the tired smile, a small, genuine, crooked human smile, the kind that appears on a face when its owner has just found the one loose thread in the universe's most expensive tapestry. "We can be inconvenient," she said. "That's the answer. We can't win a war, but the Accord has built its entire empire on one assumption, that after the Herald speaks, compliance follows smoothly, quickly, and quietly. They have never in their history had to deal with a species that makes a mess. So we're going to make a mess. Not a big mess, not a military mess, a paperwork mess, an administrative nightmare. We're going to be the first species in galactic history to defeat the Accord by being a bureaucratic nuisance. I want a name for this, said Kovac, who was already grinning, a feral echo of her own. Operations need names. Operation Papercut, said Mara, because it's going to hurt them a lot more than they think, and they're going to bleed out in tiny, embarrassing increments. They got to work, and that night, for the first time in 40 hours, the lights on Relay 7 burned bright, and the 7 of them did the most dangerous thing any species can do to an empire that feeds on fear. They had a good time. The first cut was Osei's. As Chief Signals Officer, he had spent 30 years learning the satellites, beacons, and relay stations of the Frontiers Communications Web, a sprawling, accidental, underfunded network that had grown organically out of 1,000 local agreements and had never once in its history been governed by a single set of regulations. That, Osei understood, was the Accord's nightmare, a system so messy that no central authority could claim it. He didn't try to hack the Accord. He didn't try to jam them. He simply began to forward the Accord's own documents, every ultimatum, every suspension notice, every pre-written integration form, to 6,000 other stations, beacons, and frontier outposts, with a single line of commentary appended. Received. Forwarding for comment. Current status. Refusing. By dawn, the Accord's administrative model had been hit with 6,000 polite, unanswerable copies of its own paperwork. The Herald ship began transmitting an unusually large volume of internal corrections traffic. Nobody on Relay 7 commented, but they all noticed Shay quietly marking a tick on the wall. The second cut was Ilsa's. The medic had spent the siege making herself useful in the only way medics ever do. She had inventoried every drug, dressing, and piece of surgical kit on the station, and in the process she had discovered that the Accord shuttle, docked to them as it was, shared a waste management coupling with the station's own system, a necessity of the docking seal. She didn't tamper with it. She simply filed a request with the Accord's logistics department for additional medical supplies, citing the station's integration phase quarantine requirements. And when the Accord, predictably, refused, she forwarded her request to every medical facility the Accord had ever interfaced with in this sector, appending a courteous note. Advise on standard protocol for provisioning a quarantine station under Accord jurisdiction. The Accord's administrative swarm spent the next 2 days dealing with a cascade of sympathetic inquiries from 300 confused medical facilities. Relays began, for the first time in recorded Accord history, to bounce requests between departments. The Herald ship pinged its logistics division 600 times. The third cut was Kovac's, and it was less elegant. He spent a night in the station's machine shop, and in the morning he produced, with the patient craft of a man who had built bombs out of worse, a small device that replicated, with alarming fidelity, the Accord's own compliance tone, at 1/20th power. He mounted it in the ventilation duct above the airlock, aimed at the white armored platoon, and set it to cycle. The platoon's response was not immediate, but it was gratifying. The first armored figure swayed, the second leaned against the bulkhead, and by the third cycle all 8 of them had taken up positions sitting on the deck in a neat row, helmets bowed, like commuters awaiting a delayed train. They did not move for 6 hours. When they did move, they moved with the careful deliberation of creatures whose equilibrium had been quietly, rudely, non-fatally disturbed. One of them was visibly limping. Kovac made a note to adjust the frequency, and the fourth cut was Shay's, the youngest, and the one who surprised them all. She had spent the siege not in the comm studio, but in the station's little library, a shelf of physical books that the crew rotated through on long shifts, and it was from there that she emerged, on the third morning of the siege, a sheaf of hand-copied pages and a look of terrible, adolescent conviction. I read the Accord's charter, she said, all of it, the original 40 million clause version, or as much of it as the public archive holds. And it's got teeth, this thing. It's got procedures. It's got it, Mara. It's got a clause on forcible annexation. Clause 12,884. And it says the Accord may not annex a species that has not, under the definition of the Accord's own legal code, been duly represented in the signing. And I think, if we're very careful, we can make the argument that humanity has never, in the legal history of the Accord, been duly represented by anyone. Mara looked at the young woman, at the pages in her hands, at the light in her eyes, and for a moment she forgot to breathe, because she was looking at the rarest thing there is, a species' next generation reaching for the tools of its own survival. Shay, she said quietly, how long would it take you to write that argument up properly? Shay smiled, about as long as it takes an empire to read it. On the 6th day of the siege, with the station's food down to half rations and the scrubber media countdown at 3 days, Mara made her decision, and she made it in front of the crew, because she had learned in 6 years on Relay 7 that choices made in secret grow teeth. We're not going to answer their questions anymore, she said. We're done defending. From now on we ask. What do we ask? Said Osei. Mara pulled up the recording Shay had made, a raw, unpolished, 7-voice message that had taken them 4 hours to produce, and that none of them had been willing to edit, because editing it would have made it less true. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a negotiation. It was, depending on who heard it, either the most naive question ever transmitted to a galactic superpower, or the most dangerous one. The recording began with Shay's voice, young and clear. We're asking this because nobody's ever asked it before. The Accord says it unifies. It says it protects. It says it brings peace to 4,000 species. So here's our question, and we'd really like an answer. If the Accord is so peaceful, why does it need an army to make people sign? Kovac's voice, rough with fatigue and stale coffee. 4,000 species. 4,000. And the Accord's own records say not one of them ever refused a single clause. Not once. Do you people not find that a little, statistically alarming? Or did you just never ask? Ilsa's voice, the medic, quieter, harder. I've spent my whole life keeping people alive. I've seen what fear does to a body. And I want to ask the Accord, the thing that sings compliance into people's brains, a simple question. When you sang your song at us, is that what peace feels like to you? Because it just feels like a throat being held open. Osei's voice, the veteran, utterly flat. I've signed a lot of documents in my life. Every one of them had consequences I could trace. You're asking 8 billion people to sign a document that has 400,000 pages of consequences. That's not a document. That's a religion. And religions, in my experience, get very nervous when you ask them for evidence. Mara's voice last, and her words had been argued over, hashed out, and finally, for once in her life, agreed on by all 7 of them without a single amendment. So here is our formal response to the Great Accord. It's not a no, it's a question, and it's the same question from 8 billion of us, every one of us asking it independently, because that's how we work. Why do you need us to surrender? What is it about a species that can say no that frightens an empire of 4,000 species that claims it's afraid of nothing? Shay hit transmit, and the message went out on every frequency the station had left, on every band, at every power level, into the void, where, unbeknownst to the Accord, a scattering of alien listening posts, neutral stations, and curious outposts had been quietly monitoring the strange human station that had told the Accord no. The silence that followed lasted 11 minutes. Then, from a neutral station 3 light-years away, a private channel opened to Relay 7, the first unauthorized contact of the siege. The voice on it was nervous, and it spoke in the stilted common that commercial traffic used, and it said, with the desperate eagerness of a creature that had waited 300 years to ask, "Human station. We heard your question. We have one of our own. The Accord annexed our world in the 3rd convergence. We have signed copies of the charter. We have been waiting. We have been waiting for someone to ask. Would you, transmit the full text of your response? There are worlds here. There are so many worlds here. And they have been listening." Mara stared at the console. Around her, the crew had gone very still. "Shay," she said very softly, "patch that station into the broadcast. Full power. Let them listen." "To what?" said Shay. "To the question," said Mara. "All of it. Every word. We're going to give the Accord something it has never once had to face, an audience that is actually paying attention. The Herald came to the mess hall alone, that night, without the armored platoon, without the shuttle, without any of the machinery of state, and the 7 humans looked at it and did not move. It stood at the threshold for a long moment, the deep water eyes unreadable, and then it did something none of them expected and none of them would ever forget. It sat down, cross-legged, on the deck plating, like a supplicant, and folded its long pale hands in its lap. "I am designated Translator Prime Vess," it said, and the harmonic layering of its voice was gone. It spoke in a single, thin, unadorned voice, like a woman trying to remember how to be a person. "I have been an instrument of the Accord for 312 years. Before that, for the first 40 years of my existence, I was a citizen of the Threnic Concordance, which is not a name you will find in the Accord's registry, because the Accord does not record the names of the species it restores to compatibility. I was a poet. I wrote verses about the sea, which my world had in abundance, and about the sky, which my species could fly through in the old days, before the Accord found our registration significantly more convenient than our wings." It paused, and its eyes moved across the 7 human faces with an expression, if such a thing could be read on a face with deep water eyes, that looked, at last, like naked hunger. "I have been telling myself a story for 300 years, said Vess. "The story is that the Accord is a natural force, like gravity or time, and that resistance to it is not a moral choice but a physical impossibility, and that my species' erasure from the registry, our poetry, our wings, our names, was not a crime but a transaction, the price of peace. I have told this story so many times, to so many species, that it has worn grooves into my skull. It has been the only thing holding me up." It looked at them. "And then you, 7 mechanics and a medic and a girl who reads charters for fun. You took my story and you set it on fire with a question. Not a weapon, not a fleet. A question. Why do you need us to surrender?" And I could not answer it. I could not answer it. For 300 years I have been the answer, and I could not answer it, and I understood, in that moment, that the Accord does not need species to surrender because it is strong. It needs them to surrender because it is terrified. Shay, very quietly. "Terrified of what?" "Of exactly what you are," said Vess. "Of a species that has no throat. Of a people who cannot be sung to sleep. The Accord is not an empire of soldiers. It is an empire of administrators. Its power is the power of prediction, and it cannot predict you. You do not model. You do not comply. You ask why. And why is the one datum the Accord's architecture cannot process, because why implies that the universe could be different from the way the Accord has arranged it, and the Accord is built on the single sacred article of faith, that the universe is not different, cannot be different, and will never be different." It rose slowly, and stood before Mara, and its voice, for the first time in 300 years, belonged to a creature that had chosen, of its own free will, to do something. "I am defecting," said Vess. "I'm going to walk back onto that ship, and I am going to tell the Synod that I have failed to convert a species of 8 billion poets who have rediscovered the word no. And then I am going to do the one thing the Accord has no procedure for. I am going to ask a question of my own." "What question?" said Mara. Vess looked at her, at the blood still crusted on her knuckles, at the exhaustion carved into her face, at the small stubborn flame behind her eyes that the Accord's psalm had not been able to put out. "I am going to ask," said Vess, "why the Accord's own charter, clause 12,884 of the original text, has never once been invoked in 4,000 species. The clause that says a world that refuses, in good faith, and with full knowledge of the consequence, shall not be annexed, but shall be recorded as a sovereign exception. It has never been used. Nobody has ever read it. It was written into the charter by the founding species, 3,000 years ago, as a joke, a dead letter, a monument to the idea that no one would ever want to use it. I am going to find out what happens when 8 billion people actually do." It turned and walked toward the door, and paused at the threshold, and looked back. "Freeman of Earth," it said, and the word was awkward in its mouth, a translation cobbled together on the spot, or perhaps not a translation at all, but a new word, a human word, learned and repeated with the reverence of a poet who had forgotten his craft and just remembered why he had loved it. I will be back, and when I return, I will be either free or dead, but I will not be an instrument. Then the herald who had been translator primed Vess walked out of the mess hall, through the corridor, past the white-armored platoon that had, Mara noticed, with a cold, quiet joy, not been replaced, not replenished, and were watching it pass with their helmets tilted, as if they too had been left with a question they could not answer. On the 12th day of the siege, with the scrubber media replaced by Kovacs jury-rigged filter, duct tape, prayer, and the shredded pages of a misprinted technical manual, bless them all. With the food down to a diet of reconstituted protein bars and argument, a second vessel arrived at Relay 7. It did not fold in from deep space with the clean geometry of the Accord's warships. It limped. It arrived at sublight, which meant it had been traveling for weeks, and it arrived with its drive sputtering in a way that spoke loudly of a vessel that had spent the entire journey held together by the same improvised glue as the station scrubber. It was, by the standards of any species in the Accord's registry, not a warship, or a transport, or anything at all. It was a bulk freighter, a civilian cargo hauler of a type that had been obsolete for 50 years when the current century began, and it was painted, in fading letters along its hull, with a name that made Mara laugh out loud for the first time in 2 weeks. Wide berth. Who the hell? Said Osei, staring at the readout. Sent a cargo ship to a siege? But he knew. They all knew. Because the wide berth was broadcasting, on all civilian channels, an open hailing message, and her captain, a woman whose face was a map of decades, and whose hair was the color of space itself, had introduced herself with a smile that belonged on a grandmother's kitchen table, not on a military broadcast. Relay 7. This is the captain of the wide berth. We're a civilian vessel under Terran Continuity Registry, carrying a relief consignment for your station. Food, water filters, scrubber media, coffee. Real coffee. None of that Synthros garbage. I know you've been suffering. And a few things we call comforts of home. We've been authorized by the Terran Continuity Council to render aid to stations in distress, and to politely decline any suggestion that we are doing anything else. We are absolutely not here to make a point. We are simply here, and we are not leaving. Mara opened a channel, and her voice came out hoarse with 12 days of siege and 3 days of desperation. Wide berth, this is Relay 7. You understand there's an Accord warship parked outside our station? A platoon of armored enforcers on our decks? That you're volunteering to put a target on your hull? The old woman on the screen laughed. It was a warm, rich, unhurried laugh. The kind of laugh that comes from a life lived at a pace nobody could rush. Relay 7, we're all volunteers out here. The crew of the wide berth. Let me introduce you. This is my first mate, retired Captain Amina Reyes, 84 years old, served 40 years in the Outer Rim Patrol, and she says hello, and she says she's seen bigger threats than a paperwork empire. This is our engineer, retired Master Chief Tomas Ibarra, 79, fixed jump drives through 3 wars, and he says your coolant loop looks like a punk, and he's got the parts to prove it. Tilda here is our navigator. Captain, said Mara, and she was laughing now, actually laughing, tears running down her face into the grime of 2 weeks, without a proper shower. You're a civilian freighter crewed by retirees. They'll cut you apart. The captain's smile didn't waver. It gentled. Relay 7, let me tell you a story. In the year 2047, back on Earth, a wildfire came over the ridge at our settlement, and the evacuation order went out, and my grandfather, he was 92, refused to leave his workshop. My mother went back for him. She found him in the workshop, not packing his tools, but sharpening them. The fire's coming, Papa, she said. We have to go. And my grandfather looked up and said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here when the fire arrives, and I'm going to be a problem for it. The old woman leaned into the camera. Relay 7, we're the grandchildren of sharpened tools. The Accord doesn't frighten us, because we've been frightened by plenty, and we're still here. You want to know why humanity doesn't surrender? It's not because we're brave. It's because we're old, and we've seen it all. We're just fundamentally too stubborn and too tired to bow when the bowing season comes. She sat back. The wide berth continued its slow, unbothered approach toward the station, nested in the shadow of the Accord's kilometer-long warship, like a pebble leaning against a mountain. "We're coming alongside," said the captain. "Put the kettle on, and tell whatever they call an admiral out there that the wide berth declines to be frightened this cycle. We'll try again next week, per our normal schedule." Months passed. The Accord did not return. The Accord ships did not appear in Orion arm space, and in the places where they had been, the listening posts, the trading stations, the neutral zones, a strange new music began to play, quietly at first, like a tuning fork touched to a table. The music of species asking questions they had not dared to ask for centuries. Not individually, not yet, but in private, in whispers, in the dark, where the Accord's administrators could not hear. Humanity did not celebrate, because humanity is not built for celebration, not as a species, not at scale. They built, instead, a memorial. The station at the dead end of the Orion arm, where 7 people had once told the Great Accord no, was renamed. The registry read, Relay 7, but every human who passed through the sector called it, with a grin that never quite reached their eyes, but made it all the way to their hearts. Station refusal. A sign was bolted above the main airlock. Kovac had forged it himself, out of the salvaged wreckage of the Accord's broken document reader, in the stubborn, ugly, handmade style of a species that had turned refusing into an art form. It read, in 7 human languages, and the common of the frontier. No is a complete sentence. Marichin stayed on the station for another year, because she was stubborn, and then she left, because she had a question of her own to go and ask. Shay became a lawyer, of all things, a human lawyer specializing in Accord Charter law, the only one in existence, and the Accord's administrators, when they were forced to deal with her, dealt with her the way a glacier deals with the persistent sunbeam, by melting, slowly, in official increments. Osei retired for real, moved to a garden colony near Tau Ceti, and was last seen teaching a class of alien children how to play chess, which, he said, was just human no-telling rearranged on a board. Kovac took the wide berth's old captain's offer and shipped out as her chief engineer, because she had promised him a continuously renewable supply of real coffee. Ilsa went home to a field hospital in the inner systems, where the wounded were no longer just human, because the galaxy was changing, and the wounded were beginning to include species who had finally, at long last, been permitted the dignity of asking questions. And Translator Prime Vess, the herald who had once sung the Accord's compliance into the brains of 100 species, was found, a month after the siege, sitting on a bench in a park on a neutral station, watching the stars. She did not move, and she did not know how to be free, having spent 300 years being an instrument, but she was learning. She had started, she said, by writing a poem, the first one in 3 centuries, in a language only she could read, a poem about a sea, and a sky, and a word. The word was no. The galaxy did not fall overnight. Empires do not fall overnight, no matter what the stories say. They crack, and the cracks take years to run, and the years take decades to widen. But the crack had been made. The question had been asked, and out in the dark between the stars, in 100,000 niches of the Accord's vast administrative machinery, creatures who had spent their whole existence being told what to think, what to feel, what to sign, began, very carefully, very privately, in a way that would have gotten them erased a year ago, to ask the question the humans of Relay 7 had broadcast to the universe. Why do you need us to surrender? The Accord's administrators could not answer it. That was the secret. They could not answer it because there was no answer, because surrender had never been a necessity, only a custom, only a habit, only the weight of an empire built on the premise that the universe is arranged, and it is not arranged. It is improvised. And humans had been improvising since the first campfire burned in the rain. The last log entry of station refusal, transmitted at the end of its first year under the new name, was written by the station's new chief engineer, a woman who had applied for the posting, she said, because she wanted to work somewhere that had said no and meant it. It read, to anyone listening, this is station refusal, formerly Relay 7, out beyond the last marker of the Orion arm. The Accord asked us who spoke for humanity. We told them, everyone. All the time. That's the whole thing. That's all we are. 8 billion refusals. Each one individually earned. each one the property of a single heart that decided, on its own, without being asked, that the answer was no. We don't have a leader. We don't have a throat. We have a question, and we'll be here, right where we've always been, broadcasting it to whoever needs to hear it, for as long as it takes. The Accord will not be returning. If you are listening, you have ever wondered what it would sound like for a species to win simply by refusing to lose. This is what it sounds like. It sounds like a station full of people drinking bad coffee and doing good work, in a universe that one day discovered, to its eternal astonishment, that it could not make us small. End of transmission. No is a complete sentence. See you out there. The broadcast went out, as it always did, on every frequency, at every power level, into the dark. And somewhere in that dark, in 100,000 scattered places, 100,000 separate creatures heard it. Heard the impossible, improvised music of a species that had built its entire civilization out of a single word. And some of them, for the first time in their long